What is an insight observation? By Venerable Rungruan Papa Saro, Dr. Rungruan Lim Chu Patapa. The word vipassana in Buddhism is an insight observation, which means making a total and comprehensive observation on what is happening inside the mind. In Buddhism, there is a phrase having an eye on Dharma. It simply means having a mindfulness to see what happening inside the mind as it really is in order to gain wisdom. And conclusively, the Buddhist practice is the way to develop insight wisdom to be used in resolving all kinds of problems arising within the mind. In the Brahmin's practice, the mantra meditation will rush the mind into absorption with no mindfulness development, and therefore there is no part of the abandoning of lower fetters. Also, there is no mindfulness for performing an insight observation in vipassana to gain wisdom for the final finest defilement cessation. The Buddha modified the traditional Brahmin's practice into a Buddhist practice by incorporating the mindfulness development by mindfulness meditation, and then using the developed purified mindfulness after the mindfulness absorption to see the Dharma during an insight observation. In performing the Buddhist practice, it is very necessary to understand that what we are doing in the practice is to make an insight observations on the object of consciousness in related to the component of life, including the realities of body, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, respectively, and by doing so, after having a sufficient information on what happened in the mind, then applying the Four Noble Truth analysis to analyze the truths of life within nature. Therefore, principally we should perform a practice on mindfulness development first, then performing a mindfulness meditation to improve the quality of the mindfulness to be a purified mindfulness, and then we are ready to perform an insight observation. And by experiencing and contemplating on the truths from performing an insight observation, the mind will trigger an insight cognitive process within the mind, which is called an insight wisdom, by which we can apply this knowledge to eliminate all arising defilements within the mind processing. The Buddhist practice is a systematic scientific experimentation in studying for the truths of life within nature, so-called a stream entry to be a noble person. In principle, it is very important to have a clear understanding of the principle of critical observation in four aspects of considerations as follows. Firstly, how to make an insight observation seeing as it really is with correct wisdom. Answer: in scientific experimentation we have to make an accurate observation without any disturbing noise to distort what we will see in an observation, while in Buddhism we need a very stable mind without any bias on the insight observation as it really is in nature as well. This is a Buddhist way to make a pure observation on the truths of life within nature. When saying having an insight observation on the mind, typically, it is not easy to see the mind clearly because the mind is mostly covered with troubling thinking. Therefore, it is necessary to cleanse out all the disturbing thinking out from the mind. The part of samatha in the Buddhist practice is to cleanse all unwholesome thinking, and developing a mindfulness to become steadied and concentrated in purified mindfulness with no any bias on the object of consciousness. It is very important to understand that the quality of seeing the mind depends on how good we are in cleansing all rough defilements and middle defilements up to the initial though, which is the origin of thinking in the inner mind. And in learning the complexity of nature, we must perform an observation on what happening in nature by having a firm mind on the arising phenomenon, seeing as to what it is in nature. By having a mind readiness with purified mindfulness in an insight observation, the Buddha explained this special condition several occasions as follows.
Not to make any bias on the arising object of consciousness in the mind processing. Not to swing around or to flow with any emotional feeling. Not to be in favor or non-favor on what is happening. Neither to bother with an arriving external mental phenomenon from the world. Nor to entangle with an internal mental phenomenon formulated within the mind. Not to anticipate or expect to see something to happen.
The ability to see the world in accord to the Dharma as it really is a critical observation technique to entrance into a stream entry in Buddhism. It is a type of making an observation with no personal prejudgment of what is in favor or non-favor to a self. It is an important factor in studying the nature as entering to a stream entry to the Dharma. The Venerable Sariputta answering to the Buddha on the importance of studying the Buddha's teachings on the truths of nature as follows. The Blessed One said to the Venerable Sariputta,
Sariputta, it is said, a factor for stream entry. What now, Sariputta, is a factor for stream entry?
Association with superior persons, Venerable Sir, is a factor for stream entry. Hearing and seeing the true Dharma is a factor for stream entry. Careful attention is a factor for stream entry. Practice in accordance with the Dharma is a factor for stream entry.
In the beginning of the Four Mindfulness Foundation Sutta, the Buddha explained on how to initiate a mindfulness development by both having a mindfulness breathing and having a mindfulness on body movements in every posture. That is to address the importance of mindfulness as a tool for the insight observation from the beginning of the Four Mindfulness Foundation practicing. The Buddha explained that by using a special quality of mindfulness so-called the purified mindfulness to be used in Buddhist observation on any arising phenomenon within the mind as follows.
The purified mindfulness is a special condition of mindfulness in such a way that the mind will not be bother with both the external object of consciousness and the internal object of consciousness, that is, having a mindfulness to be steady firm, not messing up with the past, and not worry of the future. As a result, the observation will be what the truth really is. And by having research on Dharma in the analysis on the Four Noble Truths, then the wisdom is gained from the Buddhist practice.
In the Buddhist practice, this is a special condition after reaching the fourth stage of mindfulness absorption, and the mindfulness will be developed into a special classification called a purified mindfulness. In Buddhism, having faith in the Buddha's teachings is considered as a preliminary condition to study the truths of life within nature, but it still is not sufficient to improve the quality of mind unless the person will carefully perform a Buddhist practice in an insight observation to experience the truths as they really are. The Buddhist practice is not designed for searching for an eternal place like a heaven or to see a God, or even the Buddha in heaven, but it is purely a learning process in searching for the truths of life within nature. In making an observation on the nature, both Buddhism and scientific experimentation share a common principle of observation. Secondly, what to be used in making a critical observation? Answer: in scientific experimentation we need a high-precision equipment and tools to monitor and to make an observation on phenomena in an experiment, while in Buddhism we need a mindfulness to monitor and to observe on what happening in the mind in an insight observation. In performing the Buddhist practice, although a meditation is very important to elevate the quality of mindfulness, but it is the mindfulness that is used to make an insight observation, not meditation. Therefore, if performing only a meditation without having a mindfulness, then there is no way to see an insight phenomenon as it really is in nature. We must maintain a mindfulness at all times, as in a statement having a meditation with mindfulness in front at all times. Therefore, in performing a Buddhist practice, we must learn how to initiate the mindfulness, and then how to apply the meditation to empower the mindfulness in the mindfulness meditation. In the Buddhist practice, we start with practicing on how to initiate a mindfulness, then empowering it by performing a mindfulness meditation, then experiencing the use of mindfulness in eliminating the arising 5 hindrances, then empowering it to manage to replacing an initial thought with liberated thinking in a mindfulness absorption, and then finally the mindfulness is improved to such a high quality of purified mindfulness to be used in an insight observation on the mental phenomenon and the mind processing. It is apparent that the mindfulness is a very important factor throughout the Buddhist practice. In Buddhism, there is a phase having an eye to see the Dharma, which means to say to have a mindfulness to see the truths of life within nature. The issue of how to have an insight observation on the nature is so critical in Buddhism, because it is the way to study and to prove that the Buddha's teachings are in accord to the truths of nature, Dharma. The observation of mind in the Buddhist practice is just like observing a frog jumping on lotus leaves in a pond. Every time when making an observation on the mind, the frog, or the mind will be on different lotus leaf just like the mind is in a different state of mind. And as the mental phenomena of the states of mind keep on changing in its states very fast, therefore a mindfulness as an observation tool also must be in a highest quality of purified mindfulness in order to perform an insight observation to detect the changing in various states of mind. This insight observation is considered as the most critical part of the Buddhist practice to gain insight wisdom. Another example is the mindfulness breathing, of which the mindfulness is used as a tool to make an observation, and the subject to be observed is the breathing as follows.
When breathing in long, he knows, I am breathing in long. When breathing out long, he knows, I am breathing out long. When breathing in short, he knows, I am breathing in short. When breathing out short, he knows, I am breathing out short.
In making an observation on arising phenomena within the mind in the four mindfulness foundations including the body, the feeling, and the mind, we also will realize the nature of these phenomena, and when connecting all the dots together, then we can come up with the reality of what is happening as a dharma of nature within the mind, and this is called seeing the dharma in the four mindfulness foundations. When saying seeing the dharma, it is equivalent to say that understanding the truths of nature, that is, seeing the arising and the cessation of consciousness. Then seeing a streaming of consciousness as a real representation of being alive, which leads to realize that a life is no self. And as a consequence, when saying a life is no self, it is equivalent to say that a life is a natural process of a stream of consciousness, it is not a self. And the role of mindfulness is the main reason that makes the Buddhist practice so much difference from others. And it is very important to initiate a mindfulness at the starting of the Buddhist practice as early as possible, so that practitioner will begin to be aware of what is happening inside the mind. Thirdly, what is the thing, subject, to be observed in a critical observation? Answer: in scientific experimentation we need to precisely make an observation on what is going on in nature, and then discovering on the truths of nature, while in Buddhist practice, at the instance of the observation we are observing on a mental phenomenon which is the object of consciousness in relation to the five aggregates of being, and then seeing as it really is in nature. And by making a complete observation, seeing a whole system of the process of dependent origination. This is a Buddhist approach to study on the mind in the threefold study strategy. In Buddhism it is to observe the mental phenomena in inner mind. In many suttas the Buddha explained about an insight observation very clear on what to be observed, especially in the four mindfulness foundations on body, feeling, mind, and dharma, was to observe on the object of consciousness in related to life including body, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, respectively as follows.
When this, an object of consciousness, exists, that, another object of consciousness, comes to be. With the arising of this, an object of consciousness, that another object of consciousness, arises. When this, an object of consciousness, does not exist, that, an associated object of consciousness, does not come to be. With the cessation of this, an object of consciousness, that, an associated object of consciousness, ceases.
The Buddha explained further in details as seeing an object of consciousness related to something in something externally and internally in the four mindfulness foundations, for instance seeing the body into the body externally and internally, seeing the feeling into the feeling externally and internally, seeing the perception into the perception externally and internally, etc. And this dependently series of mental phenomena is collectively called the process of dependent origination. In order to understand this statement clearly, the first part is to understand the meaning of seeing a phenomenon in the phenomena, such as seeing a body in the body, seeing a mind in the mind. It means that seeing an object of consciousness of a thing, for example, when saying seeing a body in a body, it means seeing the object of consciousness in related to the body as follows.
He understands the mind, he understands phenomena, and he understands the fetter that arises dependent on both. And he also understands how the unarisen fetter arises, and how the arisen fetter is abandoned, and how the abandoned fetter does not arise again in the future. In this way he dwells contemplating phenomena in phenomena internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he dwells independent, not clinging on anything in the world. That is how anyone dwells contemplating phenomena in terms of the 6 internal and external sense bases.
In another occasion the Buddha specified what to be observed in the 7 Foundation Sutta as follows.
The arising of the object of consciousness in related to the body, the feeling, the perception, the volitional formations, and the consciousness.
In the second part of statement, seeing it externally and internally, we have to understand the difference between words external and internal. That external in this context means an external mental phenomenon which typically is a stimulus arriving into the mind, while internal in this context means an internal mental phenomenon which is internally formulated within the mind. For example, when saying seeing an external body, it means seeing an object of consciousness of arriving stimulus in related to a body, like seeing a beautiful girl. And when saying seeing an internal body, it means seeing an object of consciousness of internal formulated mental phenomenon, like thinking of a beautiful girl. Similarly, the words of externally and internally of the feeling, the perception, the volitional formations, the consciousness, and the Dharma have the same interpretations as in case of the body, as follows.
When having a consciousness, we should have a mindfulness to keep the mind stable, not to be bothered with an external object of consciousness, and also not to be involved with an internal object of consciousness, so that the mind will not proceed on any troubling suffering.
The Buddha's students who were not familiar with the insight observation technique, then came to ask the Venerable Mahakaccana for advice, and he elaborated about the meaning of the above Buddha statement in details as follows.
When the Buddha said not to be bothered with an external mental phenomenon, it means that when stimulus arrives at a mind as an external mental phenomenon and a consciousness intercepts it as an object of consciousness, then we should have a mindfulness immediately and holding the mind not to cling on the object of consciousness, so that the mind is stable not to be involved in any volitional formations from the arriving stimulus. In the meantime, the Buddha's statement that not to be involved with an internal mental phenomenon, it means that by performing the Buddhist practice till the condition of a purified mindfulness is developed, by then no matter what an external received stimulus, or an internal mental phenomenon that is generated from volitional formations, the purified mindfulness will hold the mind to be steady internally, united, and concentrated from any disruption from both external and internal mental phenomena.
In performing an insight observation, it must be clearly understood that we use a mindfulness to make an observation on both an arising external and internal mental phenomenon within the mind. The Venerable Sariputta concluded on what to be observed in an insight observation as follows.
What is the observed mental phenomenon? For examples: form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness, external sense fields, internal sense fields, receptors, mind consciousness, ignorance, contact, craving, clinging, existence, birth, aging and death, etc.
In making an observation, there are 2 aspects of investigations, that is, a snapshot of observation on a particular mental phenomenon, and the continuity observations of a series of mental phenomena in mind processing as follows. On the part of an individual observation on a particular mental phenomenon, we will investigate on the arising and ceasing of a phenomenon, the cause and effect of the phenomenon, the benefit and harm of the phenomenon, and the element of the phenomenon as it is a part of nature, then we can realize that each mental phenomenon is no self, and then the mind will be liberated. And on the part of the continuity observations of a series of mental phenomena in mind processing, we will investigate on the 6 sense bases, and the process of dependent origination, then we can realize that a life is no self, and then the mind will be liberated. Specifically, what do we really see in an insight observation is a series of dependently phenomena happening as it really is inside the mind. It is exactly the same observation that the Buddha performed on the day of his enlightenment, and seeing the whole process of dependent origination. And the matter of how accurate a person can see the truths of life, not just thinking, depends on the way to perform the Buddhist practice in accord to the Buddha's teachings. There are no compromising or substitution with ignorance of the Buddha's teachings, because the only way to have a confidence in the Buddha is to have a similar experience of the Buddha, not just believing. And the suttas of the Buddha's teachings serve the most accurate way of the Buddhist practice to gain this real experience of the truths of life within nature. Fourthly, what is the purpose of this insight observation? Answer: in searching for the truths of nature by performing a scientific experimentation, we need to have enough collection of data to be tested for the hypothesis of assumption, and then analyzing if the hypothesis is correct or not, so that we can conclude as a knowledge of fact-finding of a discovery from the experimentation, while in Buddhism we perform a Buddhist practice to study, and then performing research on Dharma by applying the Four Noble Truths analysis to discover on the truths of life within nature to gain insight wisdom on how to cope with the world rightly. This is the study on wisdom in the final part of the threefold study strategy. The ultimate purpose of the Buddhist practice is to gain insight wisdom for the cessation of all kinds of defilements within the mind, not any supernatural power like in other religions. The insight observation is a very important technique in making a study on the mind as to what it really is. That is, a mindfulness will be initialized and developed to be aware of what is happening in life. Then by performing the mindfulness meditation, the mindfulness will be empowered to be used to see what is happening within the mind. Then by cleansing up all the 5 hindrances, the mind will be free from disturbing noises, and the mind will penetrate into the inner mind of initial thought in the mindfulness absorption. By this time, the mind will liberate the thinking, cutting off any preference in the thinking, and the mindfulness will firmly be at the present moment at all times, not to bias on what is happening no matter if it wholesome or unwholesome, because we will investigate on what is the cause of it and then what is the result of it as what it really is. This is a kind of purified mindfulness which is ready for performing an insight observation in the Buddhist practice. During performing the Buddhist practice, all the arising mental phenomena are not necessary to be always wholesome, but occasionally when unwholesome phenomenon may arise as what it is, by then there is no need to force the mind to be wholesome. Also, one of the common mistakes happening during the practice is an expectation to see a certain phenomenon as stated in the mind development. This will automatically force the mind to be something which is not correct. What we should do, is simply to abandon whatsoever unwholesomeness when happening, and the mind will go through the mindfulness absorption development without difficulty. And by doing so, the mind will become unbiased to what is happening, and at that instance the mind immediately attains the state of purified mindfulness. The Venerable Sariputta explained about how to gain wisdom in performing the Buddhist practice as follows.
As experiencing the insight of Dharma as it really is, then having research on Dharma, and then gaining wisdom of knowing what we should do or what we should not do correctly.
In performing an insight observation, we require a purified mindfulness to be aware of what is happening every time when having a consciousness, and by having a continuation of a stream of consciousness with purified mindfulness arise to be aware of a series states of mind happening in a mind processing, we can realize that each individual arising state of mind is impermanent, deteriorating, no self, and it is a series of mind processing as described in the process of origination. The matter of what an individual can see, depends on the quality of developed mindfulness used in the insight observation. This is an experience of introspective learning of the truths of life, as it really is in nature.